So now we're going to be hearing from Quynh and Henna. They're going to be presenting from the New England campus on the sexism and racism in our culture that lead to the hate crimes, sexual violence, and murders of Asian American women. This is occurring historically and currently at alarming and disproportionate rates due to the sexism and racism. Their title is Sexual Violence Against Asian American Women. Quynh and Henna, themselves Asian American women, have been performing emic research such that they belong to the community or population they've been researching. Etic is the opposite, and typically, it includes at least white researchers performing research on or about marginalized communities that they don't belong to. And that therefore is a form of colonizing research. So this is just another example I wanted to point out of us trying to avoid colonizing research and instead performing emic research. Okay, thank you, Quynh and Henna. Take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Kate. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. So hi everyone. Today, we hope to facilitate a conversation about sexual violence against Asian American women and also explore ways that we can address this through clinical psychology practice and educations. My name is Quynh. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I identify as a cisgender Asian and Vietnamese queer woman, and I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Vanguard Medical Associates Hospital. I am here today with my co-presenter, Henna Chandel, and I'll have Henna introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Kate and Quynh. Hi, everybody. My name is Henna Chandel. I'm a third-year student at the Antioch, New England campus. And regarding my social location, I identify as an Asian American, cisgender female of Punjabi Indian descent, and I'm a natural-born citizen of the U.S. My target race so that I'm non-white, minority female, and practice the minority religion of Sikhism. And regarding some Asian ranks, I am heterosexual and married to a white American heterosexual male. And last but not least, I want to give some awareness to the land that I'm presenting from in Manchester, New Hampshire, that belongs to the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Henna. All right, so without further ado, here are our objectives for today. Through this presentation, we overall hope to promote a better understanding of, first is the neocolonialist manifestations of racism, sexism, and classism, both historically and currently. Second is the unique challenges that are faced by Asian American women, for the vulnerability to being a target of violence and its impact on their mental health. And lastly is the integrating the practitioner, scholar, and activist roles in understanding and addressing violence against and oppression of Asian American women. And here's our agenda for today. We'll begin with presenting some of the research and concepts associated with sexual violence against Asian American women, and we'll end with the task of the psychologists adopting the practitioner, scholar, and activist model in their approach. So sexual violence means that someone forces or manipulates someone else into unwanted sexual activity without their consent. And this is rooted in the societal harmful belief that hypersexualizes Asian American women. More specifically, Asian women, regardless of their ethnicity, have been stereotyped as exotic, forbidden, submissive, and which then increases their vulnerability to being a target of sexual violence. According to a 2020 report by the Asian Pacific Institute of Gender-Based Violence, 23% of Asian and Pacific Islander women in the US report experiencing some form of contact sexual violence during their lifetime. And these harmful ideas are shaped by the legal and political measures throughout history. One of the earliest examples comes from the Page Act of 1875, and that law actually came a few years before the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was enacted to seemingly restrict prostitution and forced labor, but in reality, it was used to systemically prevent Chinese women from immigrating to the US under the pretense that they were all sex workers. And then these notions are then further complicated by imperialism and the resulting neocolonialist attitudes that have directly impacted Asian American women for centuries in the US and abroad. Neocolonialism is a subset of a working definition, but its attitude is characterized by inhumanizations and the determination of what life is worth living. And you can see that in the contemporary era, the equation of like white nationalism with patriotism has directly affected Asian American communities, even more so in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And another example is the Japanese internment camp, the forced relocations of thousands of Japanese Americans to detention camp by the US government during World War II. And an effort to then shed light on the long history of sex and gender oppressions against Asian American women are like even further complicated by the false assumptions that Asian Americans are the model, quote unquote, model minority. Asian Americans are often stereotyped as studious, successful, smart, a model minority who can excel in educations and accomplish the American dream. And despite its like positive overtone, this stereotype is damaging for Asian Americans and other students of color, because ultimately these myths like minimize the effects of racism against Asian Americans or make their experiences with racism seem less legitimate compared to those of other racial and ethnic minorities. As opposed to the stereotype of model minority, you can see that hate crimes against AAPI has skyrocketed since the COVID-19 pandemic. About 4 in 10 Americans say that it's more often for people to express racist views about people who are Asian than before the 19 pandemic. And some manifestation in current time. Most of us do remember that on March 16 of 2021, there's the Atlanta bus shooting. 8 people were murdered, having been ambushed by the self-described sex addict with a handgun who targeted 3 Atlanta's air massage parlors. And this horrific mass shootings in Atlanta reflects neither just gender-based nor just racial violence, but rather it is a manifestation of how both race and gender intersect in shaping the Asian American woman's vulnerability to violence. Then in 2022, there was a series of brutal attacks. Murders were perpetrated against Asian American women in New York City. And then there's also murders of Asian Americans in general. And I will pass on to Henna.
Thank you, Quynh. I apologize for the sirens in the background. So to further illustrate the relationship between neocolonialism, imperialism, and the resulting violence and oppression against Asian American women, I would like to briefly discuss the creation of the Japanese sex dyke or comfort women post-World War II. Now, these were women, Japanese women, who were forced into the role of prostitution to satiate the libidos of the occupying American soldiers and protect the chastity of their fellow women, an act of patriotism, the Japanese government would tell them. And while this may have been the mindset for some, it eventually led to the hypersexualization and idea of ownership over the Japanese woman's body, which was highlighted when many of the women who had married American soldiers were abandoned as American culture feared the threat of non-Western ideals. Decades later, these women continue to suffer from the neo-colonial manifestation of oppression and violence that was enacted upon them. Next slide, please. So such histories have been heavily influenced by media, which has magnified and memorialized these oppressive beliefs and neocolonialistic attitudes within American culture. This is evident in the resulting binary view of Asian American women as either submissive and sexually subservient or deceitful and sexually manipulative. And I've listed some examples here, many of which continue to impact our current culture, such as Tarantino's Kill Bill, Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, and Lorraine Michaels' Mean Girls. And while there have been some films that have broadened cultural cinematic horizons and shed light on important topics such as abuse, suicidality, and intergenerational trauma, the limitations of representations in the media and the anonymity granted by the internet pose additional challenges that include a greater vulnerability to violence. And this is just one of the many examples for one of the many subgroups of Asian American women whose destinies have been manipulated, exploited, and used to oppress them. So the impact of our social constructions have increased Asian American women's vulnerability to experiencing health challenges within a majority white neocolonial social environment. Specifically, the effect of racism, sexism, and classism render Asian American women to lead lives in which their narrative is made invisible both consciously and subconsciously by others. And this phenomenon is especially pronounced regarding the staggering discrepancy in the rates of suicide for this population compared to their minority and majority counterparts. And while there have been initiatives to raise awareness, little is known about risk factors. In fact, existing literature on mental health often excludes Asian American women entirely or completely aggregates different subgroups, effectively homogenizing Asian American women. So although there have been many and multiple factors that influence this data, it highlights both the invisibility experienced by Asian American women and that which has been mirrored and enhanced within society through systems of power that fuel a dehumanizing and oppressive climate. So typically, the model has focused on only the practitioner scholar, and both our PsyD program in Antioch and our sister program in Seattle have proposed the addition of the activist roles. So now applying this to our roles as practitioners, scholars, and activists, it's important that we, next slide. First, as practitioners, it's important that we maintain a critical awareness, understanding how both racism and misogyny are important layers of context rather than two separate forces that work together to increase an Asian American woman's vulnerability to violence and negative mental and physical health impacts. Additionally, one should be mindful that behaviors that violate social norms may or may not be pathological, as much of modern psychological practice is based in Western ideologies and values. For example, in therapy, we encourage direct eye contact. However, for an Asian American woman, this may be inappropriate or offensive. Therefore, we need to understand norms as a manifestation of a community's social constructs rather than indicative of pathological symptomology. Finally, as individuals in positions of power, it is important to be mindful of making assumptions or asserting control over our clients' being and bodies, and instead work from a strengths-based empowering perspective. Next slide, please. So as scholars, we need to keep in mind the possible colonizing epistemologies and imperialistic application of research. It is also important that we support participatory research that encourages working with, and that is led by, Asian American women in studying their experience, all while being mindful of language used and subsequent meaning making. And at the bottom, I've included a few guiding questions to this regard. I'll give you a moment to read those. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thanks. So last but not least, as activists, it is imperative to our and humanity's well-being that we strive to amplify marginalized voices and be an ally, both through continuous self-reflection and systemic level work. Thus, the power one group has over another can transform neocolonial attitudes into broader behavioral and social practices that increase Asian American women's vulnerability to violence and negative transgenerational impacts on their mental and physical well-being. Thus, as we continue our fight for social justice, it's important that we engage in iterative reflection and be mindful of individual experience, both the client's and our own. And to conclude this presentation, Quynh and I have included a few questions that we hope you may reflect on in our parting. Thank you.
Our first question for reflections is, how are generational effects influential in the experiences of Asian American individuals today? How does the historical context associated with U.S. views towards treatment of Asian American groups interact with the current U.S. biases and prejudice? How does the U.S. focus on military and mass violence as a sign of power interact with how Asian Americans are treated in the U.S.? What are some additional ways that we, as psychologists, can engage in activism, scholarship, and clinical practice in a manner that challenges colonialism and honors marginalized experiences? And lastly, how do we develop and bolster collective actions in individuals, especially given the ways in which Asian Americans are treated as invisible? Finally, we thank all for listening.